There's something there. There really is.
Okay, so let's get into some controversy here,
All right.
because this is what we do here on this show. We make friends. Well, sometimes. So here is, I'm going to pull this up. Actually, I'll just put this back here. So I have a copy of the letter alleged that Fulton Sheen wrote saying, "Don't go to the SSPX or their schismatics." Now, I have always been skeptical because it didn't seem to me, and this is it here. I've always been skeptical because it didn't seem to me to be in the style of how Fulton Sheen actually wrote. He seemed to me to be much more articulate, and the vocabulary that was used in it also didn't seem appropriate. Also, he died in 1979, correct?
Yes.
He was pretty ill near the last part of his life. He had some pretty severe heart issues, didn't he?
Right. I'd like to say the last 3 years of his life, especially multiple surgeries. Again,
Yeah.
very difficult time for him.
Yeah. And he probably, I mean, I get hundreds of emails a month that are outside of my work emails. I can't keep up with them. People email me, "I'm sorry if you're watching the show and I don't respond." I presently have about 50 in my Kennedy Report email that I just can't get to. I don't have an assistant. I don't have the time to do it. And I try my best to go to the most urgent ones. I'm sure he got thousands, if not tens of thousands a year of letters, of actual letters, which is much more difficult to reply to than an email. I'm positive he would have had assistants who would have been writing things on his behalf, because it's impossible to exist without doing that. I mean, we forget he was the most popular basically the most popular television personality in America for almost half a decade. So, okay, so let's just go through this letter here, and then let's see.
And I think
you want to say something?
but just to add to that, because I've read, many of Sheen's handwritten letters over the years, because I've spent so much time in the archives researching the books I've written, researching stories on Sheen's life, because again, I work for his cause, for his canonization. So again, I've seen the volume of mail that he received. Again, 6,000 letters a day, kind of in his glory days. But even still, remember, he was doing a weekly newspaper column that he did for 30 consecutive years, 1949 to 1979. And so there was people still writing him letters about his columns, his newspaper columns. And of course, the request to still speak and all these other things. So, and of course, he had staff that responded to these letters. He couldn't physically do, write respond to all the letters he received. It's impossible.
Well, I even have had experience, I won't name the people, but with certain big Catholic influential personalities, where I'll see, I think this might be an error. And I'll actually email the organization, and they'll say, "Oh, I didn't write that. My team did." And no harm, no foul. You trust your team, you delegate things.
Right.
I think that we have a good argument to make that I don't even think he wrote this letter. And maybe I'll just read a couple lines here, and you can tell me your thoughts and why.
Right. Okay.
So first thing, he says, if you have any, this is someone writing about a friend of hers supposedly going to the SSPX. This is in 1978. So this is 10 years, ladies and gentlemen, before any call of schism and so forth. It says, if you have any influence on your friend, I would beg you to influence her to leave the so-called Society of St. Pius X. That's the first one. I don't think he would have said the so-called. Actually, I should make this bigger here. The so-called Society of St. Pius X, because it's just called the Society of St. Pius X. There's no so-called, right? I mean, that's my first alarm bell. He was too intelligent and too kind to almost take a jab at that. What do you think?
Yeah, well, because Fulton Sheen spent so many years in Africa, and I believe he probably had met Archbishop Lefebvre in the days of work, like working in Africa, because Fulton Sheen was
French speaker too.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I know that I can't produce any pictures of Archbishop Lefebvre and, Archbishop Sheen side by side at Vatican II, or produce pictures of them side by side doing missionary work in Africa. But the fact is they both were at Vatican II, and they both did missionary work in Africa.
Yeah.
And of course, Fulton Sheen had was Monsignor Sheen back
Mhm.
even in the early 30s. So he had access to Rome and of
Yeah.
course correspondence. So he would have known of this missionary work, and there was a big push to grow the church in Africa and to
Mhm.
recognize them. So again, these two men would have been arm in arm, I think, in building the mission in Africa. So I kind of just sense, I would, even though I can't prove
Yeah.
anything, I think the two would have worked together, if that's the right word. But to
Yeah.
this term, the so-called society, um, there was many new orders being formed all the time, and so it would be you have to give them time and give
Mhm.
them a chance. And so I think you're right on that so-called, because he would have referred to congregations and organizations by their proper name.
Yes, he would have. He was a consummate pro, and he said this group has no allegedly this group has no ecclesiastical approval, um, and it can lead her possibly and her lead her and possibly her family into schism and even heresy. Um, that's way out of left field. For one, they were approved, and again, I mean, he was much smarter than you and I are. Um, but there was no claim of heresy at all with the SSPX ever. I mean, that's never been the claim. Um, the most ardent um, of enemies, let's call them, of the SSPX, even they wouldn't call them heretics. They might say they have a traditional interpretation that is no longer the direction of the Holy Spirit or something like that. But they would. I mean, heresy has never been the claim, especially not in 1978. I mean, this is not at the time of the major controversy. And then schism. There was no schism at that time. So that, to me, I look at that and I go, I don't think Fulton Sheen would have thrown around such derogatory terms if they weren't true. What do you think?
Right. Yeah. I mean, 1978 and 1988. I think, wasn't it 1988 when Archbishop Lefebvre
The
was?
consecrations, yeah.
Yeah. So, 10 years even before it happened, and you're using that language. So, I scratch my head too. Again, I don't think Fulton Sheen would use those words in that sequence
Yeah.
in 1978. That's just my
Yeah.
opinion and again, I've read hundreds of his letters that he wrote to other clergy, but also to the laity. So, it surprises me seeing how that is phrased. But
Yeah. And then this part here. Okay. This is, for me, I'm like, okay, if, let's just say this with the most kindness possible. If Sheen did write this, then this was not Sheen who wrote it, in a sense. Like, he was old. I mean, I don't think he did, but this next line here, you'll just scratch your head and you go, there's no way this is Fulton Sheen. Like, this sounds like the ex-nun who becomes the Susan of the parish council. This is not Fulton Sheen, like this giant of intellect. I mean, read his books that our friend here has produced, but also, I just read this book that Tan had sent me, Communism and the Conscience of the West. And I'm reading this thing and I'm like, this guy's got like one of the biggest brains in 200 years, for goodness sake. This is not a man who, you don't approach Fulton Sheen's intellect with kid gloves. Okay. So this line here, I just kind of shake my head and it says, the changes made by Pope Paul VI were not doctrinal changes. They merely changed the Latin to the vernacular. That's not even like, I mean, that's not even close to true. And he said the traditional Latin Mass his whole life. And from seeing his personal chapel that he said the Latin Mass up to his death. He had the Latin prayer cards on his altar. There's no possible way he could have said they merely changed it. That would betray an understanding of liturgy, which he obviously had a great understanding of.
yeah, I mean, I hear people say all the time, "Oh yeah, you guys go to the Latin Mass, and you just still it's the Mass, but
It's
in
in Latin, yeah.
Latin." And like you go, Really? It's not what I was told." But again, that's another show. So
Yeah.
yeah, but I think what even I think just kind of looking at the letter there as you're showing it on the screen, where I was kind of gobsmacked is that one line that's coming up saying
I'll
that.
bring this up here. Let's bring
Okay,
this
go
up.
ahead.
So
About
this
the
line here, yeah, about Jesus, right?
yeah, something about him saying the mass in Latin or whatever. What does it
The
say there?
Lord, the Lord never said mass in Latin. He used the language of the time. That's
Well, he never the Lord I mean, he Holy Thursday, yes, okay, but he
Oh
never
my
said
goodness.
mass, like, I don't know, like that the
He
one
never said in a liturgy of the church that was
yeah,
promulgated by a pope, if that's what you're saying.
yeah. I think that one line, that's the line that triggers me to say, Fulton Sheen would never write that Jesus said the mass and like, no, it just so that's where I have to ask that question. That wasn't, in my opinion, that wasn't Fulton Sheen.
Well,
I don't think
it couldn't have been, and
well,
sorry to interrupt, like, I did a talk at our chapel on the history of the liturgy, and there was a work circulating in the early 1900s, just when Sheen was going to seminary and becoming a priest. I'm sure he would have heard of it. It was like this incredible work called How Christ Said the First Mass, and it goes through the history of the liturgy, the sacred languages, and so forth. So even this idea that Christ used language of the time, no, he didn't. He didn't use guttural, vulgar Syriac. He would have used ecclesiastical Hebrew anyway. So he still would have been using a sacred language. So this is just wrong on 50 different levels.
mhm, yeah, so I think it's bringing questions, and I think from what I understand of this letter, because I get asked this about this letter from time to time, is that I just say, you know what, take it for what you think it is, but at the end of the day, I think you have to make up your own decision
Yeah.
of what you want to do. If you want to go and celebrate and be a part of a community that celebrates the traditional Latin Mass, you have to still wrestle with that.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times these are all letters that are thrown around to add fuel to a fire, because
Yes.
I know you're embroiled, I think, Kennedy, in this war. I want to say it, and again, it's this idea. I usually just say to people, I ask them the question, "What's it to you?" Like
Yep.
this letter that you've been sharing. What does it mean to you? Is it really something what you want to take seriously,
Yeah.
or are you just looking for a reason not to experience tradition, to
Yeah.
go down there? So,
And even if you look here quickly, so that letter was actually circulated, and it was, I think it was talked about by the Angelus Press magazine at the time, because at the time it was just circulating, so they kind of addressed the idea. But anyway,
mhm,
here's a website from the SSPX in Asia, the Asia district, and they have on there, written by a priest from the society, a biography of Fulton Sheen, because they want to make sure that their faithful know who he is.
mhm.
So this is not something that bothers the society. This is not something that has been seen as a point of contention, because people can see that this probably just isn't something that we should be looking to as a concrete fact.
Right. I mean, I get people all the time asking me, what's my own personal opinion, but I also get people saying to me, um, you know, does the Society of St. Pius X endorse Sheen's writings, or are the tradies against Sheen? And I just say, well, they keep publishing the books I put together, and
Angelus
so
Press sells
yeah,
the Sheen books. Yep.
yeah, so Angela Press, they sell all these Shane books. They sell my books on the cross,
Yep.
and of course, Lord Teach Us to Pray. So I'm saying, you know what? I don't think there's an issue with the Society of Pius X and the writings of Fulton Sheen. In fact, I think almost every religious group, the I can just name, like, I look at all the publishing arms of these many religious orders. They all have a lineup of Sheen's writings, and
Yeah.
so as I said earlier, they're all church approved. They've been vetted. They've been
Yep.
vetted. So